Welcome to Dire Straits. I'm Tracy Clark-Flory.
I'm Amanda Monti.
Today, we're talking about a growing feminist backlash that spans the right and the left. It's not just the manosphere, MAGA, TERFs, or reactionary feminists who are hating on, quote, 2010s feminism and sex positivity right now. It's also increasingly liberals and centrists who are getting in on the action. And the hate specifically focuses on women's relationships to sex, monogamy, marriage, motherhood, and men. A shorter way to put that would be women's relationship to heterosexuality.
Which is kind of our beat. This backlash claims that feminism has gone too far, that women have been made unhappy by progressive propaganda, that they're being strong-armed into polyamory, casual sex, education, careers outside the home, single-motherhood, and childlessness.
Meanwhile, as we talked about in a past episode, the Heritage Foundation is trying to strong-arm women into marriage, motherhood, and dependence on men. Like, actually strong-arm them through laws and public policy. But never mind that.
No, the real threat, some say, is that feminists wrote some snarky blog posts in the 2010s that somehow brainwashed women en masse into non-monogamy. Also, according to a very weird recent take, feminism forced women into Botox. More on that later.
Don't worry. We're not planning to rehash the adult braces discourse, but we are here to say that the Lindy West pile-on is revealing of a broader feminist backlash that has been brewing for many years. In this episode, we're going to look at folks across the political spectrum who are branding themselves as a reasonable and empowering middle ground for women. That middle ground reliably involves hetero marriage, monogamy, and motherhood.
We'll talk about a popular feminist adjacent podcast that recently blamed 2010s feminism for our problems. We'll touch on a Substack post claiming that the quote online left wants married women to be celibate. And we've got to discuss the alt-right women's magazine, Evie, which recently launched its sex issue, branding it as a new sexual revolution.
We'll also be looking at attempts to conflate so-called girl bosses with the misogynists of the manosphere and with tradwives, too.
The discourse is truly a mess out there, friends, and we've both come to the conclusion that maybe we've been a little too nice. We've thus far avoided confronting some of the troubling arguments we've seen among liberal feminists, including notably on Substack. We are over that, behind the paywall, at least. We're going to sort through all these sloppy arguments, show you how to recognize faux moderates and self-styled feminists who are really just pushing Heritage Foundation talking points, and we'll talk about why we actually feel the feminist movement is growing rather than dying. This is a paid episode. Free subscribers get a generous preview, but if you want the full and uncensored conversation, you will have to upgrade to knock down that paywall.
Amanda, I just want to start by saying I am so grateful for our friendship for many reasons, but specifically on a feminist level. I do not know what I would do without our little text threads and Instagram DMs where we're just constantly reacting to the wild things that people are saying on the internet, especially about feminism.
Totally same. Although our text threads and DMs are not little, they are robust and insane in their own way. But I mean, yeah, I'm so grateful. I don't know what I would do without them. I think it's really hard to not feel constantly gaslit as a committed feminist thinker in these very dire times. Mm-hmm. And as I shared with you, this recent discourse really got me down.
Yeah.
But I'm so grateful for our friendship and our intellectual partnership because we have been talking through this moment behind the scenes. And oddly, within maybe 24 hours, I have come away feeling even more hopeful and with a much clearer sense of what's going on here. So thank you.
Totally. And hopefully we are going to bring that sense of hope to listeners too. Yeah. But yeah, it's been like this for a while. I remember we really first started leaning on each other in the wake of the election, when it felt like there was a real backlash on the left to feminism and progressive politics. Mm-hmm. People were saying things like women and feminists need to start being a little nicer to men. We should, for example, thank the men in our lives who voted for Harris.
Yeah, that one really got under your skin, I remember.
I won't stop talking about it.
Ever.
I won't. I will not.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of people were engaging in that sort of Ezra Klein school of thought that then, he fully articulated for us shortly after that, can't we all just get along, that sort of thing, which was really just a push toward the middle. It was suggested, for instance, that so-called woke politics had gone too far and that this was why Trump was reelected. There was, after the election, a lot of throwing trans and queer people under the bus, a lot of concern for men, and next to no discussion of patriarchy or misogyny or male power. Just so much, what about the men?
Clearly, that's continued into year 2 of Trump's second term. But I do think that we had gradually seen a quieting of that moderate approach, in part because progressives have been gaining ground, and in part because Trump has been doing a great job of undermining his own former popularity. Currently, his approval ratings on the economy, for example, are sitting at a new career low. Also, I think the sadistic and murderous cruelty of Trump's presidency has made it difficult for folks to be like, but the feminists.
Right. Especially, folks responding to the presence of ICE in their communities. I mean, it's really become clear that it's coming for all of us, right? That said, over the last several weeks, we've been noticing a return of that sort of post-election backlash, right? A lot of people have seized this opportunity, that is the release of Lindy West's recent memoir, to just dump on women and feminism.
Yes. Yeah. I've been noticing how this liberal backlash is starting to dovetail with arguments from the right, from heterodox folks, and from reactionary feminists.
We should probably explain that reactionary feminism is a term used to signal women who claim to be feminists, but who see progressive politics as bad for women. So yeah, contradiction there. Ideas about women's biology and evolutionary psychology are often used to make incredibly regressive arguments about what is natural and right in terms of gender relations. Unsurprisingly, these arguments always come back to the natural goodness for women of monogamy, marriage, and motherhood.
Yeah, exactly. I wrote last year about Louise Perry, author of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, who is considered one of the most significant reactionary feminists right now. She is a case study in how these reactionary feminists sell disillusioned young women traditional family values under the label of feminism. I call it sneak attack conservatism. And it's part of what we're increasingly seeing with celebrity gossip being used by people like Candace Owens as this alt-right pipeline. So writers like Perry point to the very real problem of women's disillusionments with hetero life, which, here we are doing that so often. But reactionary feminists don't blame patriarchy as the cause. They point to liberal feminism, the sexual revolution, the pill, pornography, and so on. The researcher Jilly Boyce Kay has warned that while reactionary feminism might quote, seem to resemble feminist critiques of neoliberalism and post-feminism, it is actually based upon a rejection of social justice.
Right. And there's a sense of fatalism and unchangeability in these arguments, right? Mm-hmm. Because they are naturalizing things like rape and gender inequality. Unfortunately, we're also increasingly noticing these kinds of reactionary ideas expressed by liberals themselves, specifically those who identify in one way or another as sort of regular old feminists.
Yeah, right. The regular ones. Not the weird ones. They're the
right.
regular ones. Yeah.
Right. Like just a common, feminist. I guess we've gotten to the part of the pod, unfortunately, where we have to talk about the Lindy West of it all. Mm-hmm. As you know, Tracy, I've been on strike from this discourse, even though it's very much my beat. Like, I am a memoirist. I write about memoir and craft. It's, feminism. But I have not wanted to engage in just shaming one writer for writing honestly about her life.
Yeah.
So I'm feeling a little bit like a scab now, crossing my own picket line, but I know it's for a good cause.
It is for a good cause. I think we have to, because many weeks back now, the discourse around her book really brought out this whole new reactionary moment.
For sure. Do we need to do like a 30-second primer on the Lindy West discourse for anyone who has been blessedly offline and unaware of it for the last month or so?
Yes. Okay, I'm going to see how fast I can do this. So, Lindy West, very popular blogger for Jezebel in the early 2010s, recently came out with a memoir, Adult Braces, which deals with the opening of her marriage. At the start of the book, she is deeply troubled by her partner's wish to be non-monogamous. By the end of the book, she's in a throuple and she says she's happy. But a lot of people have read the relationship as toxic and exploitative. People have used the phrase coercive polyamory. Her spouse has widely been seen as pressuring her into it.
Right. And we should also mention that there has been some media indecency, we could say, after Sachi Kohl published a profile on West.
That was very reasonable, we should note, like a very reasonable, fair profile. Yeah.
Agreed. And Sachi was subsequently sent threatening and harassing letters by Aham and I believe Roya as well, which definitely didn't help the situation. We are not here to litigate any of this or West's relationship one way or the other. We have our own feelings about what we read, but what we're interested in discussing here is the extreme reaction to West and her book and her life and the way that so-called millennial, in giant scare quotes, or 2010s, also giant scare quotes, feminism has been caricatured in response. So to do that, should we start with the Helen Lewis piece in The Atlantic, which declared the death of quote-unquote millennial feminism?
Yes, please. Let's begin there.
If we must.
If we must.
So one of Lewis's main contentions is essentially that West is a hypocrite because she presented as a proud body positivity activist, but lo and behold, as we learn in the memoir, she still struggles with insecurities about her body. Imagine that. Essentially, crazy, right? So surprising. Essentially, Lewis is upset that West appears to be a real human woman who struggles with fatphobic patriarchal culture.
Yeah, because feminists are not allowed to be human. We're not allowed to be personally touched by the systems that we write about. So Helen Lewis writes, what killed millennial feminism was the gap between what its high priestesses demanded and what they were willing to endure themselves.
I hope when I start like a ridiculous viral internet discourse that they call me a high priestess, at least. But more seriously, what's interesting here to me is that Lewis seems to be implying that 2010's feminism itself professed that all feminists were perfect political actors. Mm-hmm. But that is actually a standard Lewis herself is setting for these women.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And the issue for Lewis seems to be that women like West, or progressives more broadly have asked to be taken at their word about their own personal experiences. And she's saying basically, well, look, West wasn't happy in her body. Also, she wasn't happy in her relationship. Then she throws in some characteristic digs at trans kids and the Me Too movement as a witch hunt, as she calls it, and says, well, see, this is the end of millennial feminism.
Right, which in and of itself says a lot about what's going on with book criticism. But I think more importantly for our purposes, she says the internet backlash against West's book shows that this is a quote, our unchallenged deference to people's own declarations about their lives has collapsed, end quote. As in now nobody can ever believe any woman who writes about her life, I guess. Ergo, feminism is dead. So to me, this doesn't really make any logical sense because, again, it's all based on the premise that feminism as a movement can only function if we believe feminists to be perfect and sort of static individuals, and also free of oppression, which the reason that we need feminism as a movement and why most women become feminists is because we experience gender oppression. Yeah. In an ongoing manner, right? Yeah. Lewis also sounds to me like she's speaking to some personal issues she has with being a good person, or maybe what she deems a good feminist, when she writes, this is another quote, millennial feminism failed because it was suffocating, immiserating, and often at odds with observable facts about human nature, end quote. So this kind of personal, reactionary, and honestly like sort of triggered attack on feminism is something that I feel like we're seeing crop up in not just this discourse, but in the motherhood discourse, the marriage discourse.
Totally. Yeah. And again, she is the one that is holding feminists to superhuman expectations that we identify what ails us, fight against it, but not also be touched by it. It's an absolute contradiction in terms.
Agreed. Lewis also really creates a convenient scapegoat of Lindy West and 2010's feminism. She seems to blame both of them for women's unhappiness. For me, I think the bigger question here and in the broader discourse, not just the Lewis piece, is who counts as a millennial feminist? I'm not even just talking about the birth year, but what exactly defines millennial feminism? Women who have written for Jezebel is the definition that I'm getting. And they're also to blame for Trump being elected. So Tracy, basically, it's your fault that Trump was elected.
I'm part of the problem.
You wrote for Jezebel. What do you have to say for yourself?
I mean, how many people have written for Jezebel? So many, by the way. But I started working there in 2018, so well after Lindy's era. But I know that Jez was often in its earliest days accused of not being feminist enough. And it really showed up after the explosion of more explicitly feminist blogs. So it's funny to now see it held up as representative of feminist thought in that era.
Yeah. Related to that, Jessica Gross, an early Jezebel writer, recently wrote on Threads that, this is a quote, there are a ton of millennial-aged feminists who are different from each other, and I resent this caricature. Gross seems to be highlighting that millennial feminism, if we can even use such a broad term, is extremely diverse.
Yeah. If you're relying on anything other than a caricature, I mean, that era of feminism, as with every era of feminism, involved plenty of disagreement, as did the 2000s era before it. In fact, Soraya Shamali published an epic 2019 feature in Jezebel when I was working there on the rise and fall of the feminist blogosphere and how women of color really built it, only for white women in that space to be given the book deals, the careers, and the major platforms. essentially women of color paved the way for Jezebel and for white feminist writers like West to go mainstream. But that's not the critique we're seeing right now, right? That's not why Helen Lewis is trying to take down quote unquote millennial feminism.
Right. No, her argument is a mess. And to be clear, there are always critiques to be had about feminism and, frankly, any social movement, especially when you're painting with such a broad brush. When I was coming up as a young academic, it was very popular to always say feminisms, plural. And if you said feminism, someone would correct you. To acknowledge, though, that there is no monolithic movement or even theory. I mean, feminist theory is a vast discipline, right? Even the notion of feminist waves has been widely contested as overly simplistic, even though we still see people using that language today.
Right.
What we're seeing, though, in pieces like Lewis's, right, is exactly the opposite of this. It's very intellectually lazy. It's sloppy. It's overgeneralized conversation about so-called 2010s feminism, defined as a movement maybe of identity and choice, and the personal is political, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute. Oddly, not much discussion of Me Too, other than, the witch hunt accusation thing, which is so problematic. No discussion of how Me Too led us to what we now know about, say, the Epstein files and so many men in power. The fact that we can even point and say, wow, look at this misogynist moment we're in is a result of that moment. And one could argue that Me Too, right, was really at the heart of the feminist movement of that decade, right? If we can say that there's one contained in the 2010s.
Well, and I also ironically see even just the ability of people to react to what they're seeing as troubling within West's relationship as a product of that feminist discourse, right? That trained people to be able to interpret relationships in that way, right?
Totally.
But also, though, I want to circle back. The phrase "the personal is political" that emerged in the 60s and 70s to express the fact that what we experience in our private lives are not just individual problems. They are structural problems. And we've seen over time how the spirit of that phrase has been co-opted and twisted into an individualistic self-help framework.
Totally. Yeah. And I would also add, and I'm sure we'll get into this more, that loose interpretations of this phrase have also added to the anti-intellectualism we see in a lot of takes on feminism today. A lot of folks seem to think that the political is strictly personal, as in, when one's politics strictly reflect what makes the most sense to you and only you personally. So it's like a weird inversion, right?
Yeah.
Of this is what works for me, which is very manosphere of thinking.
Yes.
Therefore, it must be true for all, and it is going to be the foundation of my politics. And actually a sort of one-to-one, in terms of one's politics, right? I want everybody to have to live exactly the way that works for me.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And here's the thing. The 2010s were actually a period where a lot of us were actually questioning the limits of choice feminism. We critiqued the ways that ideas around empowerment were commodified, commercialized, flattened, individualized, and totally divorced from structural analysis in some cases. And some of us started at that point of critique, and some of us, like myself, really ran with that empowerment narrative, and while living and learning and growing up, eventually came to see that an individual politics of empowerment didn't change the system. It wasn't enough.
Right. Almost like every person has their own unique feminist journey.
Imagine that. And also that people grow up and learn and change.
Right. And you can't just lump everyone into a caricature of feminism. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of millennial women discovered over the last decade that the world had not changed as much as they were led to believe growing up. And we certainly see a lot of online writers, social media posts, right, talking about this now, that they were not as free as their parents made them believe they were, or as like sort of corporate leaders maybe made them think they were. Yeah. That, though, to be clear, is not at all a failing of serious feminist thinkers who were writing at the time, like Rebecca Traister, whose 2012 essay on the impossibility of women having it all and how she hated that phrase. Without institutions and structures of patriarchy changing, I think about all the time. Yeah. That essay, I'm just always thinking about how she's knew this 15 years ago, almost 15 years ago. Women who, then and now feel let down by feminism, again, air quotes, are coming up against ideas of girl power, really, and you can be anything that you want to be, very millennial, which we talked about in our 90s youth culture episode. Essentially the wrong-headed post-feminist ideas that we grew up with, which told us women already had achieved feminist aims. Those were ideas, though, that we inherited from a tide of rising neoliberalism and capitalist co-options of empowerment and even of the term feminism. We got those ideas from MTV, not Jezebel.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. Oh my gosh, this was exactly like, right. Like, I mean, it's such a good point. Like, this was before, like, our ideas of feminism were formed before Jezebel even existed, right? And it was like millennials and Gen X that like made Jezebel happen. And so let's wind up. Yes, culture, right? Exactly. And but no, we're not looking at that. It's misattributing it to feminism as opposed to these co-optations of feminism or these post-feminist ideas. But instead, the finger is pointed at feminism. I mean, feminist scholars have written about how in that era, the performance of empowerment actually became a way for young women to defend themselves against the virgin whore dichotomy that women within certain race and class positions were freer to experiment sexually if they presented as being in control and empowered. So it was a way of guarding against being deemed a slut. That the performance of empowerment was at times a form of self-protection within rape culture, right?
Right. It was a way to claim some greater freedom of movement or simulate power, while of course still being very much stuck in patriarchal constraints. And if you're just finding our podcast, we have a whole back catalog on this stuff. Like,
yes,
we've been talking about the complicated terrain of sex positivity and the consumerism of it, and what it was like for us as young women, right? This is really complicated stuff, and it's really getting watered down in these hot takes.
Yeah. I wrote a whole book about it. Like, my memoir, Want Me, is like about this, like, coming of age. And it's like about these exact dynamics. And so I know it's really frustrating for both of us to like now meet this moment and be like, holy shit, have you read any books?
I wrote a whole book about it too. And about how it followed me into motherhood.
So, feminists have been out here talking about this shit. Like, and this is why we're friends. Anyways, any intellectually and politically credible critique of feminist empowerment narratives from the 2000s and 2010s has to engage with that reality.
Right. And with the tricky terrain of feminine agency, which we've also talked a lot about, and we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. As women, we're always struggling with two things. How do we change the systems, the world, and how do we navigate our intimate lives right now in a world that is still very fucked up and oppressive?
Yeah. Yeah. The 2010s were also a period that seeded new critiques, which built on pre-existing ones, about the lack of intersectionality within popular white feminism. Koa Beck, a friend of the pod, an author of White Feminism, could be called a 2010s feminist too. And her book is a comprehensive and nuanced critique of what is often referred to as girl boss or corporate or white feminism today. And she too was an editor-in-chief of Jezebel for a time. But the history of that site and of that era of online feminist writing is collapsed into a very simplistic caricature. Mm-hmm. Also, Helen Lewis doesn't point to a feminist journalist like Rebecca Traister, again, who is Gen X, but in the 2010s wrote a piece for The Cut headlined, "Why Sex That's Consensual Can Still Be Bad." But the reason feminists like Traister and Koa Beck are not mentioned is because it would reveal just how false it is to argue that feminists across the board were uncritically embracing narratives of sexual empowerment or polyamory in the 2010s era.
Right. And it would take these arguments out of that kind of anti-woke, provocateur genre that Lewis is writing in.
Oh no, you've hit the paywall. You're going to miss the rest of this episode where we stop being nice and start getting real about the intellectually weak and dishonest arguments that we've seen online about feminism, including from liberal feminists on Substack. We'll help you make sense of faux moderates and self-styled feminists who are really just pushing Heritage Foundation talking points. And we'll give you reason to actually feel hopeful about the state of feminism. It is not dead, okay? Truly, this is one of my favorite episodes we've ever done. So upgrade to paid at direstraitspod.com. That's straights with a GH so that you don't miss it. Paid subscribers make this podcast possible. If you care about the state of feminism, maybe you should invest in this feminist podcast in an era of feminist backlash.